He survived Manassas. He survived the Shenandoah Valley. He survived the 7 Days and Antietam and Fredericksburg. The Union Army threw everything it had at Thomas Stonewall Jackson, and none of it was enough. In the end, it was his own men who killed him, and it happened right here. This little building, sitting quiet on what used to be a 740-acre plantation in Virginia. This is where one of the most feared generals in American history took his last breath. Let's talk about how it happened. First, some quick background. Jackson grew up dirt poor in what's now Clarksburg, West Virginia. Fought in Mexico and made a name for himself there. Then spent years teaching at VMI, where his students apparently thought he was a bit of an odd duck. But that's another story. When the Civil War broke out, he resigned his U.S. Army commission, joined the Confederacy, and within months, he was at 1st Manassas. That's where a Confederate general named Barnard Bee looked over at Jackson's brigade holding firm while everything around them was crumbling, and shouted, "There is Jackson, standing like a stone wall." The nickname stuck, and so did the legend. By the spring of 1863, Jackson and Robert E. Lee had become something close to a perfect team. Lee was the strategist. Jackson was the hammer. And at Chancellorsville, Lee came up with a plan so audacious it probably shouldn't have worked. Hooker, the Union commander, had moved a massive chunk of his army into the Chancellorsville area, trying to swing around Lee's flank. Lee figured it out, and instead of retreating, he did something wild. He split his already outnumbered army in half and sent Jackson on a long, looping march through the Virginia wilderness to hit Hooker's exposed flank from the side. Think about what that means. Lee had maybe 60,000 men. Hooker had 130,000, and Lee split his army anyway. The march took most of the day. Jackson's men moved as quietly as possible through the dense woods, trying not to tip off anyone that they were coming. Union scouts actually spotted the column at one point, but the reports got dismissed. Hooker's men figured it was just a Confederate retreat. It was not a retreat. When Jackson's corps finally burst out of those tree lines late in the afternoon on May 2nd, the Union soldiers they hit were cooking dinner. That's not an exaggeration. O. Howard's men, the 11th Corps, about 12,000 soldiers, were sitting in their camps along the Orange Turnpike, completely relaxed, when the first weird thing they noticed was animals. Deer, rabbits, foxes. Everything bolting out of the woods toward them. Then came the sound. Thousands of Confederate soldiers in formation pouring out of the tree line with the rebel yell. And the 11th Corps basically disintegrated. Officers sprinted around trying to form battle lines. The lines collapsed. They fell back and fell back again, one after another, what you could call a slow-motion panic across rolling fields. It was probably the most complete surprise attack of the entire war. But here's where things get complicated. The attack worked until it didn't. As darkness fell, Jackson's corps had driven the Union troops back, but the lines were tangled and confused. Units were mixed up. Nobody could see anything. And Jackson, being Jackson, wasn't done. He wanted to push harder. He was convinced that one more shove in the dark could finish it. So he rode out in front of his own lines, into the no-man's land between the armies. Him and a small group of officers just trying to scout the ground and figure out where to push. And then they turned around to ride back. The North Carolina troops behind the Confederate lines heard horses coming through the darkness. They couldn't see who it was, and somebody thought it sounded like Union cavalry. They fired. Jackson was hit in the right hand, then hit in the left arm, then hit in the left arm again. The second ball shattered the bone just below the shoulder. Someone yelled, "Stop! You're firing on your own men!" Another voice shouted back to ignore it. "Keep firing, it's enemy cavalry." So they kept firing. Jackson fell from his horse. His men had to carry him out under continued shooting. At one point, the men carrying him dropped him when another volley came in. He hit the ground hard, which probably made everything worse. They amputated the arm. Dr. Hunter McGuire made the call, and honestly, given what medicine looked like in 1863, it probably seemed like the right move. The wound itself might not have killed him. But then pneumonia set in. Jackson was moved here, to this building, the Chandler family's office on their plantation, because it was quiet, private, and the Chandlers had offered it up as a place for the wounded to recover. He arrived around May 5th, about 3 days after being shot. For a few days, people thought he might pull through. But pneumonia in 1863 was basically a death sentence. There was nothing to be done. What happened in this building over those last few days is oddly moving if you think about it. Other officers kept sending word, asking Jackson what they should do. At one point, one of his men told him he didn't think the Confederate line could hold. Jackson sat up, practically rose up off the cot, and said, "You must hold that line." And they did. A.P. Hill got wounded. Command fell to Jeb Stuart. Stuart sent a message asking Jackson what orders he should follow. By that point, Jackson was fading. He told Stuart to use his own judgment. That was more or less his last real military decision. But here's the thing. Even as he was dying, his mind kept going back to the battlefield. He started issuing orders in his delirium, ordering A.P. Hill around, placing units that didn't need to be placed. His body was done, but somewhere in his head, he was still fighting. On Sunday, May 10th, he'd always said he wanted to die on a Sunday, his wife sat beside him and told him what the doctor had said, that he wasn't going to make it through the day. He took it calmly. "Very good," he said. "It is all right." He talked about how dying on a Sunday would be a blessing. He started drifting. And then, that afternoon, with spring sunlight coming through the windows of this little office building, he spoke one last time. "Let us cross over the river and rest under the shade of the trees." And he was gone. Lee's response was immediate. He issued General Order No. 61, announcing the death of Lieutenant General T.J. Jackson. "Let his name be a watchword for his corps," he wrote. "Let his officers and soldiers emulate his determination to do everything in the defense of our country." And then the myth-making really started. What if Jackson had been at Gettysburg? What if he'd been there for the Overland Campaign? What if? It's a question that Civil War historians and enthusiasts have been arguing about ever since. Lee himself seemed to believe the loss was irreplaceable. Jackson's arm, the amputated one, is actually buried separately in the yard of a house near Chancellorsville. People still go visit it. The arm has its own little shrine. That's how big this man loomed. Standing out here now, it's quiet. There are birds, wind in the trees. Somewhere off in the distance, you can hear cows. It's almost impossible to picture what this place was in the spring of 1863, a working plantation with hundreds of enslaved people, soldiers everywhere, a dying general inside that building. Now it's just a small, well-kept structure sitting in a field that most people drive right past. But this is where the story ended. Not on some glorious battlefield, not charging forward at the head of his corps. In a borrowed room, taken out by friendly fire, undone by a disease nobody knew how to treat. The Stonewall finally fell. Where he listens to his staff, stays behind the lines, sees a surgeon in the morning for the bruises from the near falls, and nothing more. In that version, he commands the 2nd Corps at Gettysburg. You can argue all day about what exactly he would have done differently. History doesn't run on counterfactuals with clean answers. But the honest assessment is that Cemetery Hill on the evening of July 1st is exactly the kind of situation Jackson was built for. Open window, exhausted enemy, unclear orders. Push anyway. Maybe he takes the hill. Maybe the battle plays out differently. Maybe it doesn't. Wars are complicated, but the window was there, and Jackson, at least, would have gone through it. Instead, he is 8 weeks in his grave at the Lexington Presbyterian Church, and Ewell is deciding the position is not practicable. The Army of Northern Virginia will fight for almost 2 more years. Lee will manage its retreat with dignity and tactical skill that earns the respect even of his enemies. The men will keep fighting longer than almost anyone had a right to expect. But the army that rolls over the 11th Corps at dusk on May 2nd, 1863, that army moving like that, at that speed, with that kind of belief in its own operational genius, that army dies on the plank road outside Chancellorsville on the same night it wins the greatest victory of the war. 3 bullets from its own rifles, 8 days in a field hospital. And the Confederacy never quite catches its breath again.